February 24, 2022, Russia invades Ukraine in what was designed as a smash-and-grab military mission. The objective was simple: catch the Ukrainians by surprise, overwhelm the country's forces, and take Kyiv. In doing so, Russia would control the rest of Ukraine, depriving it of the independence it had held since the breakdown of the Soviet Union in the process. And it almost worked. President Vladimir Putin's troops got as far as the outskirts of Kyiv before Ukraine managed to organize its defenses and fight back. Support from the international community started flooding in, bolstering Ukraine's forces and giving them access to the equipment and munitions they needed to repel the Russian invasion and even launch counterattacks. But it shouldn't have been enough. Even with all of the support flowing into Ukraine, Russia's military is supposed to be strong enough to defeat a nation that is a fraction of its size and strength. So why hasn't it? Why is Russia's army so weak when for years it's been touted as one of the world's strongest militaries? After all, the statistics paint a picture of a country that could bulldoze almost any other on the planet. According to Global Firepower, or GFP, which ranks countries annually based on the strength of their militaries, Russia is the second strongest in the world. It only just falls behind the United States and is ahead of China, with a military so massive that it should be the envy of most other countries. Just take a look at the numbers. When it comes to sheer firepower, Russia has 1.32 million active military personnel, with a further 2 million sitting in reserve. That's not to mention paramilitary forces, such as the infamous Wagner Group, which is 250,000 members strong. Throw in conscription, which the country has started to enforce since the beginning of the Ukraine war, and Russia has access to a further 46.4 million people outside of its active military that it could push into service. On the surface, it also has the second strongest air force in the world. GFP says it has 4,255 aircraft in stock, with 2,766 of those being in a state of combat readiness. Again, the only country that beats Russia's air force is the United States, at least in sheer numbers. And yet we've seen Russia fail to take advantage of its aerial superiority time and time again in Ukraine. More on that later. For now, let's focus on Russia on the ground. Again, the numbers show its supposed might. A staggering 14,777 tanks, the most in the world, and 161,382 vehicles are in the Russian armory. It has the most towed and self-propelled artillery in the world, as well as a huge stock of 3,065 multiple-launch rocket systems. Then there's its navy. On paper, it's the largest in the world, with 781 assets. It has the most submarines, 65, and the most corvettes at 83. Russia is also heavily adept at mine warfare, with 47 vessels. Frankly, Ukraine shouldn't have stood a chance. If Russia's military is as strong as it appears on paper, its ground troops should have steamrolled through Ukraine, supported by an air force that would make it incredibly difficult for Ukraine's ground forces to fight back. Russia's navy should also have held the Black Sea, allowing the country to send more troops into Ukraine, while also buffeting its coastlines with attacks. But none of this happened. Instead, we've seen Russia get bogged down in a war that's lasted for over 2 years at the time of this video's creation. Its Black Sea fleet was roundly defeated, its air force has failed to establish aerial dominance over Ukraine, and even its ground troops, though they've slowly managed to gain ground in the country, have suffered massive losses that some sources estimate to be veering close to 500,000 people. In short, we've seen Russia exposed as a paper tiger, a military that looks dominating on paper but is revealed to be much weaker when at actual war. All of which leads us to the key question we'll answer in this video: why is Russia so weak? There are many reasons behind Russia's strength deception, starting with the corruption that runs rampant through not only its military, but also in the general Russian leadership structure. In a March 2022 article examining Russia's failure to take Ukraine quickly, Politico highlighted the effects of corruption on Russian troops. It cited reports that some of the country's soldiers had received rations that expired in 2015, noting that there's a connection between Yevgeny Prigozhin, the late main patron of the Wagner military group killed in a mysterious jet crash in 2023, and many of the companies that make these rations. The implication was that Prigozhin was taking the money he got from Russia's government and using it to line his own pockets. Former Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny practically said as much when campaigning against Putin, claiming that Prigozhin's companies essentially operated a cartel that gamed the Russian bidding system to land huge contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Very little of that money would go towards supplying the food and equipment Russia's troops needed. As for Navalny, he was imprisoned in 2021 on charges of embezzlement. Around 18 months later, he went missing from his cell for 3 weeks, only to be found in another prison located in the Arctic Circle. By February 2024, he was dead. Russia is accused by many Western governments of having killed him. Politico's article goes on to report that Russia's troops involved in the initial invasion of Ukraine were held back by a lack of fuel they needed to push forward. Again, corruption was likely the cause of this problem. Russia is one of the most fuel-rich countries in the world. Even with the many sanctions placed against it by Western countries in the wake of the Ukraine war, it's still the world's third-largest oil producer. And yet, it couldn't keep its own troops stocked up with the fuel they needed to complete their mission. Embezzlement may have been the issue here as well. Russia's military often refers to fuel as its second currency, indicating long-standing knowledge that the fuel that's supposed to go to the military is often siphoned away to line other people's pockets. These are just a couple of examples. And it gets worse for Russia on the corruption front. In a 2020 report, Transparency International and its Government Defense Integrity Index placed Russia in Band D. That indicates a high risk of corruption, owing to a lack of external oversight on budgets, policies, and the activities of the institutions the country relies upon to provide for its military. It's a real-life example of the idiom, "when the cat's away, the mice will play." Only in this case, the Russian state cat turning a blind eye to the many mice in its military system allows those mice to severely undermine the strength of the country's military. Kickbacks and theft are commonplace according to Action on Armed Violence, with Russia's military reflecting its social hierarchy: rigid, brutal, corrupt. A trio of issues leads to those at the top getting richer, while constantly having to watch their backs, while those on the ground in Ukraine have to deal with situations that shouldn't affect any modern military. But corruption is far from Russia's only military problem. There's also the fact that the invasion of Ukraine wasn't even a military decision, it came from the Kremlin. To understand why that matters, you need to know what the Kremlin is. Though the term Kremlin is often interchangeably used with military when it comes to Russia, the two are separate. The Kremlin is actually Russia's government, and it was this group that planned and launched the operation in Ukraine, not the military. That creates problems of its own. Like in the military hierarchy, those in the Kremlin are both subject to corruption and fearful of the possibility that they may lose their position. The latter issue was especially important to what we see in Ukraine, according to GIS. The research organization suggests that Putin's Kremlin advisors were likely too scared to inform their masters of the true state of Russia's military, leading to Putin heading to Ukraine with a misinformed view of his military's true might. It's because of this lack of communication within the Kremlin that we've also seen so many Russian logistical failures inside Ukraine. GIS highlights one instance that it says is symbolic of Russia's logistical failings. Near the beginning of the war, a column of soldiers from the Roskvardia, the Kremlin's National Guard unit, were sent toward Ukraine in lightly armored vehicles. Those soldiers weren't equipped with guns or similar military apparel. Instead, they went in more as riot police than soldiers, being given shields, batons, and helmets. Their objective was to control the streets of Kyiv. The reality was that they were essentially lambs to the slaughter for the city's defenders, showcasing the Kremlin's complete lack of understanding of what its military actually needed to take the city. This singular instance of poor planning is symptomatic of what's happened throughout the 2 years that Russia has been fighting Ukraine. Rand expands on this, pointing out that the Kremlin utterly failed to anticipate the invasion's logistical requirements, going as far as to suggest the Kremlin may not have even had the capacity to understand this requirement. It points out that Russian troops rapidly ran out of equipment and ammo in the early months of the war, making it impossible to either seize territory or maintain control over territory they had already taken. And the situation isn't getting much better. In a November 2023 report published in Pravda, the news outlet reported on the UK's Ministry of Defence, or MOD, and it claims that Russian military personnel on the front lines in Ukraine face terrible living conditions. Supposedly, soldiers who had returned from the front lines had been wet from head to toe for several weeks and were even unable to light fires in their camps. After all, doing so could alert Ukrainian forces to their positions, meaning they were forced into eating monotonous and perhaps outdated rations in the mud while they waited for orders. It all adds up to Russia failing to provide its soldiers with what they need. Corruption is part of the reason for that. The equipment just doesn't exist in some places. But the Kremlin's failure to plan its special military operation properly, seemingly just operating under the assumption that Russia would achieve an easy win, led to a poor logistical setup. In other words, even the equipment that Russia can provide to its soldiers on the front lines either isn't getting to them or isn't usable once it's there. Let's take a deeper look at the equipment. Russia has increasingly relied on old Soviet stock to attack Ukraine. According to European Security and Defense, or ES&D, Russia's initial February 2022 invasion saw its best-trained soldiers going in with the most modern equipment the country could provide. It was the Ukrainians who were forced to rely on outdated Soviet-era technology, at least until the support started pouring in from the global community. By the summer of 2022, the situation was starting to reverse. That's when the first losses of the demothballed tanks that were previously left to rot in storage before being used in the war, were recorded. We've seen Russia using T-62s in Ukraine, as well as T-54 and 55 tanks, some of which may have been built as far back as 1946 in its attacks. ES&D also points out that Russia has pulled about 40% of its Soviet-era tanks and armored vehicles out of its Baratia base for use in Ukraine. Russia has reasons for using this old equipment. They were deployed to provide non-precise artillery fire to support ground troops, which is itself indicative of the fact that Russia had lost a lot of its tube artillery. Those older tanks were also kept in territory that Russia already occupied, allowing them to strengthen the country's defenses in anticipation of Ukrainian counterattacks. Some of the T-54s and T-55s were even used as kamikaze vehicles, being loaded with explosives before they were sent to Ukrainian positions. Still, the fact they're being used at all suggests Russia is running out of more modern equipment. Take the Sosna-U thermal imaging systems that were built into the country's T-72 tanks at the start of the war. Those are becoming less and less common as the war goes on, with the T-72s that Ukraine captures showing that Russia has started using older and cheaper systems. Switch focus to armored personnel carriers, and we start to see howitzers that date back to the 1940s being deployed, as well as naval guns from the 1950s being mounted on some vehicles. All of this outdated equipment can be effective, but it also shows that Russia's military failed to modernize to the extent it needed to handle a full-scale war. If it had, Russia wouldn't be using the Soviet-era weaponry at all. It would have better tanks, artillery, and armored vehicles that were more than capable of defeating most of what Ukraine had to offer. So we're starting to see a confluence of issues leading to the weakened state of Russia's military. Endemic corruption, both in the military structure and the Kremlin, is exacerbated by terrible military planning leading into the war. Add to that a surprising lack of modern equipment. Perhaps corruption played a role there as well, and it can feel like we're seeing a version of Russia from the late 1980s fighting in 2024. Let's bring things down to the troop level. We've already touched on how Russia's poor logistics and planning are forcing its soldiers to endure terrible conditions on the front lines. However, we haven't talked about Russia's strategy of sending wave after wave of untrained or drafted soldiers to the front lines. In many respects, it appears to be employing a cannon fodder strategy in which it tries to overwhelm Ukraine with masses of poorly trained soldiers. There's plenty of evidence for this. In September 2022, Forbes published an article in which it claimed that Russia's practice of drafting untrained soldiers was equivalent to the Kremlin committing premeditated murder against its own people. That report built on another earlier in the month that suggested Russia was about to draft 300,000 soldiers, none of whom it would be able to train properly. Putin's announcement of that draft came with the caveat that only those who've previously served in the armed forces and have particular military specializations would be drafted, with the goal being to boost active forces up to 1.4 million. That announcement met with protests in Russia, which were exacerbated when the Kremlin ordered that Russian airlines could no longer sell tickets to any man between the ages of 18 and 60. While problematic in its own right, that ruling alone shows that Putin wants all able-bodied Russian men to be available to him. More worrying for those draftees is the lack of any real training. According to Forbes, Russia's initial training for soldiers is cursory by design, with most of the training intended to happen on the front lines with experienced soldiers showing recruits the ropes once they arrive. That's a shaky system at the best of times because it splits the focus of frontline troops. But in a war like Russia faces in Ukraine, it can have a devastating effect. Not only are the troops on the front line already struggling with a lack of supplies and equipment, but many of them can't exactly be considered veterans themselves. A new draftee may end up being trained by someone who only has a few months more experience. When the training works, it's because the recruits work alongside a brigade's 3rd Battalion, which is often reserved for training, while the brigade's other battalions are fighting. But in Ukraine, those 3rd battalions are all fighting as well, meaning there are very few soldiers left over to help the draftees. The result is an inconsistent training system that's entirely reliant on the quality and positioning of the unit to which a draftee is dispatched. A brigade that has no veterans and limited equipment, as is possible given Russia's logistical and corruption issues, isn't going to be able to properly train a draftee. That brings us back to the Forbes article suggesting that this approach is tantamount to murder. It cites the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, when it says that mobilized men with a day or two of training are unlikely to meaningfully reinforce Russian positions. As for the training those new soldiers receive on the front line, it's often non-existent, as the ISW discovered when speaking to a then recent draftee to Russia's 1st Tank Regiment. That draftee claimed that he'd received no new training in the days since he'd arrived at the Kherson Oblast in Ukraine. He was operating based on the 1 or 2 days of training he'd received before he deployed. It gets worse. If new draftees are essentially cannon fodder due to their lack of training, some Russian soldiers are literally treated as such. That's according to a February 2024 article in the Kyiv Post, which quotes a Russian soldier from the 5th Separatist Motorized Rifle Brigade as claiming that many in his unit are being thrown onto the front lines, not because of their value as soldiers, but because they're ill. He says many who are on frontline duty in Ukraine's southern military district are seriously ill, with many having tuberculosis and some, including himself, being HIV positive. So here are 16 people who have hepatitis, suspected tuberculosis, lung disease, tumors in their heads, he says when describing the soldiers he's working alongside. That's hardly indicative of a well-oiled fighting force. Untrained draftees, many of whom are ill, are essentially being used to soak up Ukrainian bullets and artillery, and therein lies another reason why Russia's military is so weak. The Kremlin doesn't appear to care about its people. In its desperate grab for the material power that would come with claiming Ukraine, Russia appears to have started ignoring the human cost. Many of the country's soldiers are fighting on foot without real support, with Utah State University saying the approach shows that the Kremlin's tolerance for human casualties is only growing higher. In other words, losing tens, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of people in the war doesn't matter because Russia can always replace those people with more warm bodies. Of course, the inevitable happens when there's such callousness on display from leadership. Morale tanks. The Washington Post argued in March 2022 that a large proportion of the early troops sent into Ukraine simply didn't want to be there. That's supported by the number of Russians who've left their homeland since the war began. That number could be as high as 800,000. The early days of the war also saw many videos cropping up on social media of Russian soldiers leaving their tanks, begging for food, and even looting. Footage of captured soldiers would also sometimes show their confusion over why they were in Ukraine in the first place. Contrast that to Ukraine's ground troops. Though far inferior in numbers, every Ukrainian is fighting to protect and preserve their country. Morale may dip at times, especially when Russia makes advances, but motivation is never a question. Russia is trying to break Ukraine's spirit with an army filled with soldiers who may not even want to be there in the first place. Tack everything we've talked about so far – poor training, bad logistics, corruption, old equipment, and the Kremlin's apparent willingness to sacrifice soldiers to gain ground, and you have a recipe for a morale crisis. Those morale issues are only made worse by the disunity in Russian command. We touched on this earlier when highlighting how the Kremlin launched its Ukraine invasion seemingly without paying any heed to the true state of Russia's military. The Foreign Policy Research Institute, or FPRI, digs deeper with a March 2023 report that claims Russia's subpar performance in Ukraine is a result of the country's failure to decentralize military decision-making. Every decision has to come from Putin or the small collection of his trusted advisors, with those in the middle levels of Russia's military unable to make decisions for themselves. This centralized approach also creates communication problems throughout Russia's entire military structure. Either important information gets distorted as it passes up or down a long chain of command, or it simply doesn't get communicated at all, as may have been the case when the Kremlin was making its invasion decision. The FPIR claims that this centralization in decision-making is the result of a society that has rarely ever been overseen by a government to which its population wholly consents. Autocracy reigns supreme in Russia. Putin's long tenure as the country's president demonstrates that, with the Russian autocrat rarely facing legal restraints or any control mechanisms that could influence decision-making. How does that manifest into Russian military weakness? A Russian non-commissioned officer, or NCO, barely wields any power. They are trained not to show any initiative or to make decisions on behalf of the soldiers that serve underneath them, instead acting as little more than intermediaries between the Russian hierarchy and the soldiers on the front lines. That approach is dangerous enough when you consider that all orders come from a government that may not be fully aware of what's happening on the front lines in Ukraine. But it becomes practically foolish when you consider that people on those front lines have practically no way of telling the Kremlin what's happening. Adjustments become more difficult to make. Tactics and strategies can't be tweaked to react to the situation on the ground. Russian soldiers are basically pointed in a direction and told to go, without any consideration given by the country's hierarchy as to the situation those soldiers face. In other words, information doesn't flow freely. And given that information is one of the most important assets that any military can have, that's a massive problem for Russia's military. It's also a problem that likely contributes to the country's seeming lack of tactical and strategic nous. Again, we've touched on this already when speaking about the terrible planning that went into Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But it's perhaps most obvious in the way that Russia's Air Force, the VVS, has almost completely failed to establish aerial superiority over Ukraine. That should have been an easy task. As we mentioned earlier, Russia has thousands of aerial assets, with Ukraine only having around 320, with only 177 of those craft being in a state of combat readiness. Worse yet for Ukraine, most of its planes were Soviet-era designs, meaning Russia's more modern planes should have easily taken the skies above the country. That didn't happen. In an interview with the United States Air Force Lieutenant General Scott Kinsvater, Cambridge Economic Policy Associates, or CEPA, announced that the US considers Russia's aerial performance to be very poor. Kinsvater cited a complete lack of planning capacity, as well as Russia seeming to have no ability to coordinate aerial assaults with the rest of its armed forces, as a key reason for that rating. Combined with the misuse of equipment, which may stem from bad training for Russia's pilots, and you get a VVS that has failed to learn lessons dating back to the Second World War. Kinsvater says that war marked the first time that countries started using their aerial assets to support soldiers on the ground, yet Russia doesn't seem to have done that. In his words, the benefits were so great that they effectively resulted in 1 + 1 = 6, and he cites endemic corruption as being the possible reason why Russia hasn't evolved to use aerial tactics that the United States has used for decades. He also suggests that communication is an issue in two ways. The obvious one is the lack of communication between ground and aerial forces, making it impossible to run operations in tandem. However, Kinsvater also suggests that the flow of information within Russia's military has been hampered by those in command, not wanting to reveal how poor the VVS had become in the wake of years of investment made into new aircraft. It all feeds back into this idea that Russia is little more than a paper tiger. Russia has been responding to these sentiments in peculiar ways. As Ian Williams, a research fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, points out, we're seeing Russia being a little more aggressive and greater risk-taking right now because they are trying to offset this perception that they're kind of this paper tiger. That's in reference to several incidents in which US Air Force drones had unsafe encounters with Russian jets in July 2023. One of those encounters resulted in a Russian pilot positioning themselves in front of an American drone before engaging their jet's afterburners. Those encounters are somewhat provocative, though no fighting will result from them. They're really examples of Russia trying to prove it's stronger than the rest of the world seems to believe. And therein lies the problem for Putin. His war in Ukraine has exposed that Russia's military is far weaker than it looks on paper. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to lose the war. Even a weaker than expected Russia is still fairly strong, as demonstrated by the country's recent, small yet significant gains in the Kyiv region. But Russia isn't the juggernaut that people believed it to be. If it was, it would have steamrolled Ukraine long before any international intervention could have prolonged the war in the country to the point where it's been going for over 2 years. Now Russia appears to be in a position where it's trying to save face while asserting dominance, all while the world's other militaries continue to gain insight into what the Russian war machine is really like. But what do you think about the Russian military? Is it truly a paper tiger that could be defeated if it took on a country with a stronger military than Ukraine? Or are we seeing a Russia that's actually holding back, with its true strength likely only to be revealed if it faced a larger threat? Tell us what you think in the comments section, and thank you for watching the video. Now go and check out why Russia's Navy is in serious trouble, or click this other video instead.